Hello to everyone, and welcome to the first edition of ITInsights live briefing call. This is the first time we do this, and we'll be focusing on the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a proposal by the European Commission that is expected for next week. My name is Guido Lobrano. I'm the Director General for Europe at ITI. ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council, is the global voice of the digital sector. We represent 80 of the most innovative companies from all the segments of the tech industry. Beyond Europe, ITI has a presence in the United States, Latin America, China, India, and South Korea. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Courtney Lang. Courtney is ITI's Senior Director of Policy for Trust, Data, and Technology. Courtney is also one of the most senior cybersecurity experts at ITI, and she works on a daily basis on policy initiatives by various governments around the world. She has also a broader portfolio that covers, among other issues, artificial intelligence. So thanks for joining, Courtney. I'll turn to you in a moment. Let me maybe spend a moment on the concept behind our Insights briefing call series. So the idea here is really to provide a top-line overview of upcoming key proposals, discuss how the proposals may impact the digital economy, and also provide ITI's initial comments and views on certain initiatives. I'm really glad that we've seen so many people wanting to join this first ITI Insights briefing. As I said initially, for this call, we will focus on the European Cyber Resilience Act that will be published next week. The way we will do this is that after some short background points on the Commission initiatives, we will explore with Courtney the expected impact of the various options that are currently on the table, and also discuss the perspective of the tech industry on this issue. And this is clearly relevant because the tech industry will be one of the main players in the discussion moving forward in the implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act. We will also have time for questions in the second half of the briefing. So please submit your questions using the Zoom's Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screen. As you know, the Cyber Resilience Act will be published next week around Tuesday, so we do not have the full details. But as many of us often need to react quickly after the proposal is published, we really want to offer what is a preliminary overview and a perspective in advance of the adoption of the Act. This being said, as a number of you probably know, there has been an opportunity to see some of the elements of the proposal that have started going around Brussels just this morning. So today's discussion is actually a great opportunity. It's very timely to start assessing these elements together. Now, preliminary elements are not an official version, so we still want to be cautious. And again, Courtney will try to explore the potential elements that are on the table, point to those that we've already seen, but also what else might happen. When the proposal will be published next week, ITI will also issue an official press release where we will make a very first reaction on the content of the proposal. So in terms of background, let's spend a minute, seeing what led to this moment. It was almost exactly 1 year ago, on 15 September 2021, when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced the Cyber Resilience Act, which was aimed at setting common cybersecurity standards for connected devices. At the time, the president said that if everything is connected, everything can be hacked. And she also added that the growing number of connected devices also increases vulnerability to cyber attacks. The president also noted how the EU should not just address the cyber threat, but also take the opportunity to become a leader in cybersecurity. So it's against this background, and also the fact that there's been a growing number of high-profile cyber attacks with a global footprint, that we see this proposal coming up. In 2020, I think the annual cost of cybercrime to the global economy was estimated to be 5.5 trillion euros. The rise of digital products across various sectors led to even more emerging challenges. The CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, will be published, which will be published next Tuesday, aims, first of all, to ensure a consistently high level of cybersecurity across the entire life cycles of wireless and wired digital products, and also of auxiliary services. The CRA is not, being published in a vacuum. It adds to the recent NIS2 proposal, so the new directive on security of network and information systems, and also complements the 2019 Cybersecurity Act, among other pieces of legislation. So maybe before going into the specifics of the CRA, let me turn to you, Courtney. Can you speak broadly about the overall views of the tech industry about the goals that the EU is trying to achieve with the Cyber Resilience Act?
Yes, absolutely. And thanks, Guido. I think at the top, it's just really important to say that we as the tech industry absolutely support the EU's efforts to improve cybersecurity. It's very important to be looking at resilience across economic sectors as the threat landscape is, rapidly evolving. Things are changing. It's never been more important for both the public and the private sectors to be acting, with security in mind. And so we're very supportive of the EU's efforts to uplift cybersecurity. We at ITI have certainly been engaged in a number of EU files aimed at cybersecurity over the last couple of years, including, the EU's Cyber Act in 2019 and most recently NIS2. So we've really been engaged with the Commission and others in the European Parliament and Council in order to, really help to shape these legislative proposals in a way that will achieve, those objectives of improving cybersecurity resilience. I think, maybe another thing to mention at the top is that increasing transparency and advancing secure product and software development life cycles is also something that we're, very supportive of, and that will help to strengthen the overarching security of the ecosystem. But, at the same time, I think it really depends on what direction the Cyber Resilience Act takes, and that will serve to determine how effective the act ultimately is in achieving those objectives of uplifting cyber resilience. So, that I think is broad-based how we would view it.
Thanks a lot, Courtney, for this initial take. As I mentioned, there's a growing amount of information and details that are emerging lately on the Cyber Resilience Act. So I will briefly try to summarize what we understand from the Commission thinking on the upcoming proposal, what we've seen over the course of the last few days. The first thing to highlight, I think, is the scope. The CRA is largely expected to cover connected devices. It's also, we understand that, there will be a differentiation and the scope will cover what are likely going to be defined as products with digital elements. So these would be software or hardware products that include components that would be placed on the market separately with a data connection to a device or a network. There will also probably be some specific provisions related to what would be defined as critical products with digital elements. So these would be those that perform a function that is critical to trust, security functions, which could be, for example, network control and protection. Apparently, the Commission is looking at two classes of critical products here that would be covering almost 40 categories, so very broad. And these categories would be based on the core functionality of the product. And so examples of the first class would be standalone and embedded browsers, network management systems, management software for mobile devices, and routers and modems. Examples, apparently, of the second class would be operating systems for servers and mobile devices, for example, smart cards, and also a number of products intended for industrial use, like industrial IoT devices, firewalls, and microprocessors. So again, there's probably almost going to be about 40 categories. So it's a very broad scope. And it's likely that these products, the critical products with digital elements, would be subject to conformity assessment, either a self-assessment or a third-party assessment through notified bodies. Also, an important mention, I think, is that it's likely that those AI systems that are deemed to be categorized as high risk according to the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is also being discussed and negotiated right now, they will also need to fulfill essential requirements set out by the Cyber Resilience Act. The core of the regulation, of course, is the requirements. And so the CRA is expected to establish a number of essential cybersecurity requirements that products in scope would need to comply with. Also, manufacturers would need to undertake an assessment of the cybersecurity risks associated with a certain product. And then based on that assessment, they will need to ensure that the product complies with certain essential requirements. And we're talking about probably a dozen essential cybersecurity requirements, where the baseline would be that products will be designed and will need to be produced in a way that ensures an appropriate level of cybersecurity, and also shall be delivered without any known exploitable vulnerabilities. And then, based on the risk assessment, other requirements would include a secure by default configuration, protection from unauthorized access, protection of personal and non-personal data. Also, they would need to be guaranteed security updates, and the products will need to be designed in a way that limits attack surfaces and reduces the impact of incidents. We also expect a significant part of the new proposal to focus on effective enforcement, and that could be achieved by granting powers to national market surveillance authorities, for example, to conduct sweeps, so coordinated control actions of specific products across the European Union. And also national authorities will be able to issue fines for violations of the provisions of the new Cyber Resilience Act. So again, this is all to be confirmed. This is based on information that we have seen and we hear, but I think it's helpful to put it together and then to make a sense of this all with you, Courtney, and see what could be how the industry will address this moving forward. You already highlighted industry support to improve cybersecurity resilience and also the importance of a holistic approach. Now, based on the potential elements that we have outlined before, Courtney, what do you think the Cyber Resilience Act will mean for the digital sector? And also, what could it mean for digitalization in Europe more broadly?
So again, I mean, based on just what we've seen, which, as we've noted several times, has not yet been confirmed, I think what it appears is that the Commission is attempting to take a mixed approach, utilizing soft law measures as well as some more regulatory requirements. So, that was one of the policy options that was set forth in the call for evidence. And, according to what we understand, that was the option that most respondents had said would be the most effective option. And that actually, was something that we also advocated for, really the importance of taking a risk-based phased approach to the implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act. One of those things that we, had put forward was this idea, right, of the tiered approach. And what we see, at least in this unconfirmed kind of text that we're discussing right now, is the idea of a risk assessment being undertaken and kind of utilizing a baseline for products across the ecosystem, and then potentially layering on additional tiered requirements for critical products that are then potentially going to be required to undergo, an additional level of conformity assessment. So, I think as a general matter, it's definitely a good start. There is, I think, still certainly going to be room for improvement. I think you mentioned the scope of the measure. That's something that I think, will need to be worked through a little bit further. And so, that I think will kind of need to be thought through. Beyond that, I mean, I think it's also important to note that kind of utilizing this phased approach will also potentially help the Commission, right, to kind of figure out where practices are working or are not working. And then as they kind of utilize that evidence and take it into account and see what's happening, additional requirements could be layered on after the fact. Although, kind of what we're seeing in this proposal at the minute is just this kind of broad-based, okay, there will be these kind of baseline requirements that every single digital product or element has to meet no matter kind of where it's situated. And then there's this kind of additional set of requirements, if you will, for those products that are deemed critical products. So, overall, I think, they're attempting to take a mixed approach, but, at the moment, we're seeing a lot on kind of the regulatory side, and that could theoretically, pose a risk in that it could become very onerous if the scope is not appropriately targeted, and it may not actually serve to meet every single cybersecurity objective that they're seeking to meet if, it's not appropriately targeted. So, we can talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but those are some kind of initial thoughts on what it could mean. The one thing that I would add is that because there is a horizontal approach being taken here, that does reduce the risk for fragmentation of policies. So that is a positive. Certainly, one of the other options that was considered in the call for evidence was an ad hoc regulatory approach where, different sector specific agencies could intervene and create cyber regulation where they deemed it necessary or appropriate. And the risk with that is certainly, you might have sets of regulations coming out of one sector, the transportation sector, for example, that differ from, a different sector, and that can create a very complicated landscape for product manufacturers and software manufacturers and developers to navigate. And so kind of taking a more horizontal approach with this low-level baseline is a way to ensure at least that products are not going to be expected to meet a series of different requirements based on, the ultimate end use and what sector they're being used in.
So, the phrase I think is overused, but the devil lies in the details. So I think we need to see exactly how the scope will be defined and the requirements. But clearly, the two are very closely connected. As you were saying, certain types of requirements make sense for maybe a more defined category of products that are more high risk or critical. Spreading them across a very large categorization of products might create a number of challenges for economic operators, but not only. There is, I think, in the call for evidence of the European Commission that you referred to earlier, there is also a reference to the positive economic impact coming from this proposal. So can we maybe spend a moment talking about what these type of measures might mean for all the actors involved, from vendors to service providers, but also consumers and users? And again, how could this affect the broader economy?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. So for vendors, in particular, product manufacturers, I think it's important to note that a lot of manufacturers are already developing their products with cybersecurity in mind. So there is a good portion of, manufacturers that are already meeting, a lot of the requirements that are laid out in the leak, at least of the CRA. That being said, those that for whatever reason haven't been meeting them would be required to meet them in one way or another, of course, depending on what sort of product they are developing, and then ultimately kind of where it's being used. That may also, make additional requirements necessary based on, kind of this tiered approach that they're taking for critical products. Beyond that, I think another interesting point here is that they are seeking to cover software to some extent. And, that was something that even in the call for evidence we commented on, because I think software is particularly unique in the way that it is both developed and deployed. And so that does pose an interesting challenge for the application of regulatory requirements. One of the things that I think is important to note is, software is developed by one person, and then it could be utilized in an environment that was, different from, what the initial developer had intended it for. And so because of that, the component author could design a software for use in this one environment, but then it's deployed in another environment that it's ill-suited for, and the developer might not have, any idea that that's going on. And so I think there is some interesting kind of conversation to be had about roles and responsibilities and how, these sorts of requirements might work in the case of software, because additionally, I think it noted in the draft, that updates must be available and things need to be delivered, free from known exploitable vulnerabilities. I mean, the way that software is just created, developed, and deployed, right, is when it's developed, it's one thing, but it can vary very quickly. And so changes happen a lot more rapidly than with a traditional product. And so things are constantly changing. And so certification for software, for example, might be a very challenging proposition because you're only kind of certifying it at one point in time. And then by the time it's delivered, if there is, a vulnerability that emerges between the time that, a developer has it and then it's placed on the market, that I think could present a challenge as well. So thinking through some of those questions will be important. For consumers in particular, and I know you asked about the positive economic impact, I think, consumers will of course benefit from products that are more secure. So to the extent that they are buying products that perhaps are not designed with security in mind from particular manufacturers, that will be a benefit. But at the same time, I think there's really a consumer education component and kind of awareness raising component that goes into this as well, because, as you mentioned, the call for evidence suggests that there will be a positive economic impact, but this is kind of an indirect positive economic impact because for the most part, at least from anecdotal evidence, we've seen that consumers don't necessarily care deeply about cybersecurity and don't know enough to really understand what some of this might mean. And so there really is a need to educate consumers in order to kind of turn those requirements into increased purchasing of products that are deemed secure, right? So you need to educate a consumer on what it means if this product has undergone this, whether it's self-assessment or third-party conformity assessment. What does that mean for me and for the product that I am purchasing as the consumer? Because without kind of doing that extra educational work, I don't quite see, a direct link to positive economic impact. And on the flip side, I mentioned this earlier, but, depending on the way in which, as you noted, some of the details are going to be worked out, I think there is the risk that this has, a more negative impact to the economy than is anticipated, because, there could be onerous requirements that are being applied to products that don't actually, pose a high risk, or the context in which a particular product is being used is not as risky as the critical products list might deem it to be. And so that can serve to, I think, undermine the ability of businesses to innovate when they're very concerned about meeting compliance for low risk products. And that's not to say that I'm suggesting that high risk products should not be held to a particular standard, but that there does need to be, I think, consideration of the various level of risks that are, potentially being, or potentially appearing in the deployment of a product in one particular context or use case versus another, and kind of what that means on the whole. So those are a couple of thoughts around kind of the vendors and consumers and things that might need to happen in order to really translate to a positive economic impact.
And the additional piece of that is, of course, that, as we hinted earlier, the CRA is not the first and only piece of legislation that addresses cybersecurity. So there's also other elements. We've talked about the recent NIS2 directive, the Cybersecurity Act, and a number of other, I think, elements that are spread across different pieces of legislation, including the AI Act, for example, but also maybe provisions on data protection, for example. So it would be interesting to see how proposal will complement, improve, or coexist with other pieces of legislation. Now, before you answer, maybe just a quick reminder to the people that are listening: if you have any questions that you want to share with us, please use the Q&A, write them down, and we'll address them in a few minutes. Thanks. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, we have been engaged in the development of various pieces of legislation in Europe aimed at improving cybersecurity. And so, you know, how it's going to fit together with that existing legislation is something that we've, you know, been wondering, and is a question that we've had for the Commission. Again, in the, you know, text that we've seen, I have not done a deep dive, but I anticipate there is some you know, explanation of how this will work with NIS2, for example, as well as the EU Cybersecurity Act. But I think it is really important that those things are either deconflicted or appropriately aligned, and that it's very clear to manufacturers how, you know, for example, the Cybersecurity Act and the specific, you know, certification schemes that ENISA is able to develop kind of interplay with this connected device or cyber resilience regulation that's coming out, because it would seem that some of those schemes might be able to be leveraged in order to demonstrate compliance, but kind of being very clear about what that looks like would be helpful. I'll also note that, you know, in, I believe it was 2020 now, November 2020, ENISA released guidelines to secure the Internet of Things supply chain. And so there are a lot of baseline practices in there that will likely be, you know, appropriate to leverage. Again, that's a voluntary document, so it's not, you know, a mandatory set of requirements that providers or manufacturers need to comply with. But again, making sure that that is leveraged will be important. And then you mentioned NIS2, I think also kind of understanding how the articles related to cyber certification will play into this, and how kind of critical infrastructure providers and essential operators are implicated under that, and how they will have to comply with NIS2 as well as the Cyber Resilience Act, and how will they meet, you know, all of those varying requirements, and to what extent. I think the last piece of legislation that's interesting to mention is the Radio Equipment Directive update as well. You know, that's being updated to incorporate cybersecurity requirements. So once again, it would seem that there might be products that fall under the scope of both, especially given kind of where the scope is right now with the Cyber Resilience Act. And so again, making sure that those things are deduplicated to the extent possible will, again, help to foster, you know, an environment that is ripe for competitiveness and innovation. Oh, Guido, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I was just, you know, already thinking about what you were saying, and, you know, I think what is helpful, maybe also based on the information that we have so far, it looks like, you know, there will be some carve-outs from the Cyber Resilience Act that refer, for example, to very specific sectors like medical devices, aviation security, that are already regulated. So partly, you know, some of these things have been addressed, but indeed there's a lot that, you know, still needs to be discussed and better understood. We already got a couple of questions in, and we'll get to them just in a second. I just wanted to have maybe a last question from me for you, Courtney, which relates to the fact that, you know, the EU is now presenting the Cyber Resilience Act. How is this approach, given, you know, your experience with what we see in ITI in a lot of other jurisdictions around the world? How is this going to be different from what we're seeing in other places? What lessons also can we draw from these other global initiatives that can be helpful in the discussion that we're going to have in the European Union?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Guido. And I think, you know, as a global trade association, it's really important that we are looking at kind of the landscape globally to understand how different countries are approaching this, and again, how to facilitate approaches that are aligned and interoperable to the extent possible. What I will say is that this is a somewhat unique approach. We haven't particularly seen other countries take an approach that covers such a wide scope of products. You know, we've seen, I think, a particular focus on IoT product security and consideration of either minimum elements or security baselines for IoT products. or for that specific subset of products, as it were. But it seems to me that the CRA is intended to focus on kind of a broader set of products and services, which is a little bit more, I think, expansive than some of the other efforts we've seen. In the US, for example, we have seen NIST put out a voluntary IoT security baseline, NIST 8259. There are also a few state level laws in the US related to IoT security, but nothing at the kind of comprehensive federal level. And again, that's specific to the Internet of Things. This proposal seems to encompass a broader set of digital products or products with, as they say, digital elements. We've also seen, other countries take, I think, a voluntary approach in many cases to securing the Internet of Things. There's a number of different voluntary baselines, one of which I mentioned that was put out by ANISA. And so, leveraging kind of voluntary certification as a means to demonstrate assurance, but certainly not as many mandatory schemes that we've seen out there. We did see, I think it was last year, the UK put out a consultation seeking to regulate consumer smart products. So that would be kind of the closest, I think, regulatory measure that we've seen. But even that, we encouraged kind of a very clear scope of what was meant by a consumer connected product so that it was kind of appropriately targeted and narrow. I haven't seen, the updated version of that, but I do know that that was something that was being considered last year. Like I said earlier, there's certainly something to be said for taking a horizontal approach so as to avoid divergent kind of policies in different sectors or in different areas. But, at the same time, it's important to recognize that a scope that's too broad might not only prove challenging to implement from a resourcing perspective, but again, might not actually address the discrete cybersecurity risks. Second part of that question was kind of what can we learn? I think a couple of things. First is that, and I think at least in the text that I've seen, the EU is attempting to do this, but that it's really useful to focus on security outcomes or outcomes that you would like a manufacturer provider to meet, as opposed to kind of prescribing specific technical implementations within law, right? This allows for flexibility in terms of manufacturers being able to take the steps that they deem are appropriate in order to meet those security-focused outcomes, and also kind of future-proofs the legislation in a way that will allow for the evolution of products and services, and also account for the rapidly shifting threat landscape. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but really ensuring that there is a clear scope. That's something that we've kind of seen in different policy proposals is in certain cases kind of a muddling of scope, or it's not particularly clear what is covered. And I think in this instance as well, it will be absolutely important to be clear what exactly is encompassed under the CRA, because, definitions of digital products and digital elements, what exactly is meant by that. I know we have kind of this critical products list, but again, I think there is still room for, some additional thought around that. And it also might be useful to kind of think through how and if the definitions are aligned with kind of those that are being used elsewhere, for example, in international standards. And that kind of brings me to my last point, is just that, in all of these policy proposals, whether that's IoT or more broadly, it is, very, very important that the EU relies upon international standards, and those are really the standards that are vetted. They're consensus-based. They, provide top of the line information and guidance for defining and implementing effective security methodologies. They really facilitate common approaches to cybersecurity across the board, allowing for interoperability and collaboration, as I mentioned earlier. And so that really should be kind of the basis for a lot of this work. So whatever kind of the requirements are that these products will be, required to meet, leveraging and relying upon those voluntary international standards, the base standards, will be incredibly important. And certainly we encourage EU policymakers, as always, to work together with industry on kind of ICT standardization, et cetera, within the existing international and European structures, so that you are, in fact, getting kind of those consensus-based standards included. So I think I will stop there, but I know we have a couple of questions. So
yeah, no, thanks for this. I mean, it's really helpful. And maybe let's stop for a moment. The last point you made about reliance on international standards, and also the fact that a broader scope may be beneficial because indeed it might help avoid fragmentation, primarily within the European Union single market. But clearly, we increasingly need to look at the global market. And so this is a point that we often make as industry to all the different governmental stakeholders we interact with. You need to make sure that whatever regulatory initiatives you take are convergent and consistent, and help industry comply without needing to actually look at each market differently and develop products and services for each market in a way that is not necessarily consistent. So international standards are clearly a fundamental basis for achieving that. We've seen it in the context of artificial intelligence. We are seeing it in the context of cybersecurity. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And actually, there is a question that is related to that in a way, because we have a question from one of our listeners that is asking about how this new regulation could impact third country industries investing in the European Union. So I think in the first instance, it might be interesting to see what are the elements of the proposal that would affect differently non-European providers or manufacturers of these services. And I think this leads to elements related to conformity assessment, for example, but there could be also other aspects of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as you know, I haven't had the opportunity to kind of review the entire proposal in great depth. And again, it's not confirmed, so would want to wait to see kind of the final released text. But certainly, third country industries selling products into the European market would also theoretically be required to comply with the regulation. And so, it's not just for, providers that are domiciled in Europe. It's for anybody placing products on the market. And so theoretically, it would have implications for providers everywhere around the world that are seeking to, provide or sell into the European market.
And I guess another consideration, the person is referring to investing in the EU, so that could be meant in a number of different ways. And so I guess, of course, the positive would be that, if this goes the way it's supposed to be going, meaning the European Union will become a more resilient and more secure space, then of course the investors will be more prone to come to the European Union because of this. On thinking about the background that we've outlined before of the increase of cyber threats and the increasing cost of cyber incidents. I think we still have a couple of minutes, and there is another question. So I'd like to look into that, although that's a bit more specific. Out of the 40 or so categories of critical products, are there some whose companies and manufacturers might find it particularly difficult to comply with? And are there any specific kinds of products mentioned in the list of critical ones that we think shouldn't be considered critical? I mean, I think this really requires a little bit of a deeper dive into the elements that we know. And again, I think these are details that might change. I'll let you answer, Courtney, but my immediate reaction to this is that, of course, I think it's less about whether companies might find it difficult or feasible to comply, and more about how proportionate some of these requirements may be for certain products or users. And so generally, I think, especially if you think about maybe larger companies with more resources, to a certain degree, they can probably always comply unless it is technically not feasible to comply. It's just a question of cost. But then the cost is justified for a certain type or category of product that maybe is for professional use or for very specific critical context. And that same cost would not make a product viable for maybe a more consumer-facing type of situation. So I think this is I think more the logic that we will be looking at in this context. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would generally say the same thing. I mean, it's not really about the specific, whether it's difficult to comply or not. I do think it's about the proportionality to some extent, and where, it may not be appropriate to kind of have these stringent requirements because the level of risk is assessed to be, low or almost none. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I mean, on the second half of that question, I truly haven't had a chance to kind of review the critical list in great depth. So at the moment, I don't want to say, this should absolutely not be on the list. Again, it really depends on the context and the end use and kind of where things are being used. I think there's a different, risk factor if you're using something in, a particular, again, even in like a hospital, there are different use cases, right? Yeah. So you could be using something in a surgery room versus, a computer that a nurse is entering, particular information in on. So I just think there's kind of different risk assessments that need to be done and taken into account. And so, again, I haven't reviewed the categories in great depth, but I'm sure in the future weeks we'll have, some additional thoughts around that.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you very much for for joining this first edition of ITInsights live briefing. This leads us, I think, to the end of this first episode. I think it's clear that this will be a very, very important proposal for the digital sector, but honestly, probably for the whole of the economic texture of the European Union. So stay tuned. Let's see what we'll see coming out next Tuesday. ITI will issue an official reaction, so happy to share it with the general public and with any of you who's interested. Please do not hesitate to reach out individually as well if you'd like to discuss this in further detail. Thanks again for being with us. Thank you again, Courtney, and stay tuned also for the future editions of our Insights Live briefings.